God with you. For those of you who are newer to Centerpoint, my name is Vic Anderson, and I've been part of the church for a really long time and love to proclaim the scriptures. I wasn't sleeping for the last 3 months. Instead, I have been in Ethiopia and doing a lot of preaching and teaching. Maybe a little later will be some of the things that are happening there. I'm kind of cutting in and out, it sounds like, right? I don't know why. Let's see if we can check all the wires. All right. We'll see. Everybody says we don't know what's going on. But it is really good to be back. It's a pleasure and a privilege to speak in other churches and other places in the world. But you know, I long to come back to my family. And it's great to be with you because you are the people of God. We are the people of God, called out from the world and chosen by the Father, redeemed by the Son, being transformed by the Spirit, and journeying together to that great day when the reign of Christ will fill the earth. I'm glad we get to be together. On modern automobiles, there are so many lights on the dashboard that you almost need an advanced degree to understand all the things that can happen. But there's one light that when it comes on, we all get it right away. It's usually a bright yellow light. And when it comes on, you have this kind of sickening feeling in your stomach. It's not rare, but it tells you that you got to do something. It might be that you're on a long road on a vacation trip and you're trying to really make time, make progress, and that light goes on. Or it could be that you're running a bit late for work. It's always the worst time, and you really need to get to the office or get to your workplace, and then that light comes on. Or sometimes you just have to get to that appointment across town, and it's just at that time that yellow light comes on. It's that yellow light that says, low fuel. You're about to run out of gas. And if you ignore it for a few minutes, it will go from a flashing light, at least in my car, to an audible beep. That's going to get your attention because it's telling you you have a fuel deficit. You can't keep going. I mean, the government may be able to run on deficit spending, but your car won't. And so, you know, I've really got to stop and replenish the tank. As bad as it is to have the tension of a low fuel light beaming at us, it is much worse in our lives when our joy tank runs at a deficit. When we find ourselves walking through the days and there's just not much joy left. And it seems we can hardly move forward because that light, you really can't ignore it when we run out of joy. It happens when, you know, the defeats seem to outweigh the successes, when the disappointments outnumber the encouragements. This joy deficit occurs when the defeats surpass the victories. And you say, man, I'm just going through the motion of living, and my tank is low. How do we replenish our joy tank? What do we have to do in order to see a sense that there is, in fact, going to be or is joy in our lives? That's what we want to work on this morning, and we're going to do it by looking at a text where Jesus, where the gospel writer John actually takes an event from the life of Jesus, and while it is a simple event, it is something that speaks so clearly to meeting our need for a joy-filled life. We're going to look at this event in detail and see how in fact this rather simple miracle, the first one in the Gospel of John, provides us and provides John's readers with a great sense of encouragement. And then, having kind of looked at the details of the historical event, we'll take a step back and ask, well, what does this mean for our faith? How does this challenge us as people of faith? And then, finally, we'll ask one more question. Where's the call to commitment from this passage? Indeed, John writes to us not just to fill our minds, but to call us to a very clear commitment based on our faith. So I trust you'll find it encouraging, as I have in working through this text in recent days. What we're going to find, first of all, is that in the first century, there was a wedding. And when the wine ran out at that wedding, Jesus miraculously changed water to exceedingly better wine. When the wine ran out, Jesus changed water to exceedingly better wine. We're in John chapter 2. If you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn there. And we're going to look in on the scene of a first century wedding, a time when Jesus was alerted, first of all, to the need for more wine. And his response initially surprises us, but then he does, in fact, take care of the problem. John chapter 2, we begin in verses 1 through 4 and find out that how Jesus discovers this problem at a wedding. John chapter 2, verse 1 says this: On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, They have no more wine. Woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, My hour has not yet come. Stop there for just a second. The first century wedding is a week-long joyful celebration. And it's not just one of these afternoon deals, right? You have to provide food and drink and for a whole host of guests that have probably traveled for a long way to get there. There's going to be feasting, there'll be wine. It's a high point for the family. I mean, you have to imagine that with arranged marriages in particular, this has probably been negotiated for a while. Families have been involved as people have arranged for two young people to come together as husband and wife. And they've been envisioning this life together. So it's going to be a time of great joy. They've been planning the wedding. They've invited guests to the wedding. They have arranged accommodations for the guests. They have procured the food. They've gotten special clothes for the bride and for the groom. And they're getting helpers for all of it. And the anticipation has been building for a great wedding banquet. What a week of celebration this is going to be. Our son, our daughter, going to be married. And then in this case, tragedy strikes. It is a crisis. No more wine. Now, everyone around you, all the people who have come, they could well think, what, you didn't provide for us? We came all this way and you didn't plan enough food and drink for us? How could you possibly run out of the most important ingredient in a wedding celebration? Guests brought their gifts and they brought themselves expecting this kind of return. You have to understand, of course, that in the first century, you couldn't run out to your local grocery store and find wine for a whole wedding party. It was not instantly available like it might be in a large city like Dallas. This joyful occasion is in danger of being forever tarnished. And so Mary, the mother of Jesus, goes to Jesus and says, they've run out of wine. And he seemed not to share her concern. Did you notice how he replies? Woman, which we might think is a harsh thing, is probably not a harsh term. He's probably, woman, which probably distances him a bit from his mother-son relationship, because he has another agenda that he is more concerned about. And that's what he means when he says, why do you involve me? Her agenda to take care of these people is not exactly his agenda. He has an agenda from his Father. And the way he will say that is, my hour has not yet come. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And yet, Jesus has compassion, a quiet compassion that he exercises in this scene. Jesus does not share Mary's concern, and yet he's going to deal with the deficit of wine that exists. He miraculously changed the water to exceedingly better wine in verses 5 through 10. So chapter 2, verse 5, we read through the rest of the story. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used for Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now, draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted that water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water, they knew. And he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you saved the best till now. What a surprising thing. Stop there. Jesus engaged in this simple, straightforward, quiet miracle, and in a surprising way changed water to wine, and abundant wine. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to 180 gallons of wine. If you take 6 water pots and it's 20 to 30 gallons each, that's a lot of wine. You and I don't measure wine in gallons. You don't get gallons of wine usually. That, in today's terms, at about 750 milliliters per bottle would be 757 bottles of wine. Now think about that. You can't get that in your trunk, right? This is a lot of wine, many bottles of wine, so to speak, that Jesus provides for this family. He provided not only high quantity, but high quality. The master of the ceremonies realizes this is better than anything we've had. It's exceptional. End of story, right? Crisis averted. What a kind of a cute story, right? These poor people who are going to have a tragic experience at their wedding. Of course, those are always the best stories to tell afterwards, right? But no. They're able to say, we don't know exactly how it happened, but we thought we were going to run out of wine, and then somebody found a whole new supply. Jesus does this so quietly because his hour has not yet come. He is probably not wanting to be known as the wine dispenser for Galilean weddings. Not the reputation he wants. I doubt that John is writing this to teach us anything about, we should value wine and make sure you have plenty at your next wedding. John has something much more important going on. What does this text mean for our faith? Because we know that it is written for our faith. I'd suggest this. Jesus is the divine source of exceedingly joyful life. Jesus is our divine source for an exceedingly joyful life. Jesus takes care of the joy deficit that his people experience. He's a fountain for life that is exceedingly joyful, better than anything else that we could manufacture or possess. He is the Messiah who brings the joy of the kingdom, the one who produces a life that ought to be. Now, we got to unpack that a little bit, because not everybody gets a full measure of wine at their wedding, right? The story is written to help us to believe that this is the Jesus who does that, who provides us with an exceedingly joyful life. And there are several proofs, several kind of indications and hints in this text that we easily read by if we're not careful. So I want to draw them to our attention so we'll see exactly what John is doing with this great text. In verse 11, he calls this a sign. We didn't read it, but let me draw your attention to verse 11. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. It is a sign, it's something that signifies something else. It's to proclaim something. And more specifically in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, when a sign is given, it's usually to say, what you just heard from the prophet is true. It is valid. He's reliable. He's communicating something from God, and you can count on it. So a sign is often used in the Bible to give this idea of you can trust it. He's signifying something. John, verse 11 here says, he is signifying or revealing his glory. What is the glory that the disciples get to see? Well, John's already given us a hint earlier in chapter 1 when he said, in the beginning was the Word is with God, the Word was God, chapter 1, verse 1. And then you come down to verse 14, and the Word became flesh, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten. In the Gospel of John, the concept of God's glory, the glory revealed through the Son, is that the Son has come from heaven above. He's come to reveal to the earth what God is really like. And that glory, of course, is going to culminate in Jesus dying for the sins of the world and providing eternal life. This is all part of his glory. And so somehow, in this provision of exceedingly good wine, is the sign of the glory of Jesus. Because you see, not everyone can turn water into wine. There's something miraculous here, that Jesus came as Messiah, because this kind of miracle points to the King and his kingdom. We'll hear from our memory verse this week even a little bit about how John is using the concept of signs to reveal the glory of God and to stimulate our faith. So he says in chapter 20, right, there are many other things that Jesus did. Jesus performed other signs, the text says, in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these, the signs that John did give us, the 7 signs of the Gospel of John, these are written so that you might believe what? That Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So the disciples saw what Jesus did, and John says, I'm putting this here so people can see what the disciples saw. Wow. He came from heaven to reveal something about God himself. The disciples, it says, believed in him in verse 11. They saw in Jesus this miraculous creative power, and their faith in him is stimulated, it's increased. It went from kind of a level 3 to a level 4. They've got some more believing to do. They got some more growing to do, but this was one of those signs that kind of pressed their faith forward. It won't be forever. It'll be for his disciples who got to see what he did. So that's kind of one of the first proofs about how John is helping his audience believe. But why draw such attention to this private miracle? I mean, there are other things that seem to be much more grand, much more open, much more amazing. Well, John leaves a few more breadcrumbs in the that are so important to us. This is a wedding, and there's wine. And throughout the Bible, the idea of a wedding with wine is almost always often used as a symbol of joy, the joyful relationship between God and his people. And I could take you on a tour, which I will not do, of text after text after text, where the idea of Jesus or God and his people being united in a wedding kind of relationship. A breaking of that, of course, is akin to adultery. And so the wedding is often the symbol of how God and his people are brought together. And wine, of course, the symbol of joy. You're all very familiar that the same author, the author of the Apostle John, will eventually be found in the book of Revelation to speak of the wedding supper of the Lamb. And this picture of a wedding banquet is the great union between Jesus and his people. Could it be that John says, hey, I want to show you a real wedding that reminds us of a grander wedding between Jesus and his people? Kingdom prosperity and joy are often symbolized in the use of wine. One of the commentators that I benefited from his study, he pointed out that from Joel, from Amos, from Jeremiah, you have these statements in the Old Testament that speak of the joy that is symbolized in wine. For example, Jeremiah 31 says, quote, "They will be radiant with joy because of the Lord's goodness, because of the grain, the new wine, the fresh oil, and because of the young of the flocks and herds." He's talking about Israel being back in the land. And one of the great blessings of joyful prosperity is the way that wine will flow. The book of Amos, speaking of the coming age of the Messiah, is described where the mountains will drip with sweet wine and all the hills will flow with it. Book of Joel, the vats will overflow with new wine and fresh oil. Over and over, we have this use of wine in the Old Testament and the New as a symbol of the joy that God provides when he blesses the world and makes it the way it ought to be. When there is peace and prosperity and the people can celebrate the way life should be. When John's readers hear about a wedding and Jesus providing wine, I'm convinced their minds would go right to this idea. Oh, he's talking about the joy that comes when God and his people are in close relationship with one another. And how does it happen? Jesus provides it. But there's a little more data that makes this quite fascinating. Jesus uses 6 water pots from ceremonial washing. Did you catch it? It's there in verse 6. Why on earth would John take all this trouble to point out that he used 6 water pots? Well, first of all, 6, of course, is a number of just short of perfection, not complete, not full, but he uses 6 water pots that are used for ceremonial cleansing. And you all know that in the Jewish way of thinking, of course, coming out of the Old Covenant, taking part in the commands of Moses, that there were several cleansings that people did in order to indicate that they were ceremonially clean and able to worship. So when the reader sees that Jesus says, pour this water in those pots, it would have been associated with the old covenant, the old way of cleansing. And now Jesus transforms that into this exceedingly joyful wine. What John is saying here is that there's an insufficiency in external cleansing. External cleansing can't get you this joy. The old covenant, as good as it was, can't do what Jesus is going to do in a new covenant in providing wine for his people, a new way of relating to God. John is stimulating our faith that this joyful life from Jesus exceeds all others. That's the statement of the master of ceremonies, right? You save the best for now. So you put all that symbolism together of a wedding with wine and ceremonial washing pots, and the reader is going to be gripped with the reality that what John is talking about is Jesus is going to provide a relationship with God that is characterized by joy because it's better than anything else you could manufacture. He takes care of the joy deficit. May I suggest to you that for Israel, this is going to be really hard to believe. This is not going to be easy to swallow because they were convinced that the old covenant was the way that they would relate to God. They were convinced that cleansing and ceremony was indeed the way that they were going to get joy and even settle in the land and have prosperity. But Israel was to see that their old wine would be insufficient. They'd be living in a joy deficit if that continued. They were to grasp by faith that the water of ceremonial cleansing was not sufficient to bring them the joy that Jesus could bring to them. For our faith, may I suggest to you that we also find this quite hard to believe. Maybe not because of ceremonial cleansing, but we like to, we just find it hard to believe that this kind of joy can exist. The life we experience is so often characterized by a depleted tank, a deficit that we just kind of learn to live with. We recognize that despite the joyful birth of a baby that we would love to have as that kind of experience of life all the time, what we experience instead is the constant reminder of death and joy being extracted from our lives. Just in the last couple of weeks here, we had a family of 4 in South Dallas sitting at a gas station, a fuel station, and a couple of kids were street racing. And one of the cars collided with the van, and it burst into flames, and all 4 were killed. A few days later, a vehicle was taking an off-ramp just south of Fort Worth from the expressway. A drunk driver hit their vehicle, and it exploded in flames. 4 people were killed. And just this Thursday night, we heard of the Dallas police officer who was targeted by a deranged individual who just wanted to kill police. And he approached him and executed him while he sat in his car. And we can't imagine how those families would ever recover joy. But these scars will stay on them for a long time. But even for us, as we live with this onslaught of recognition that says joy is really not something we expect, John comes and ushers in this statement. Joy comes through Jesus, the one who turns water into exceedingly better wine. Believe it. Notice that this does not mean that our lives are filled with all the joys of the kingdom today. I think when Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come," not yet. We still live in the not yet. While the bringer of joy, the provider of joy has come, we still wait for the full culmination of all the kingdom blessings. But they will come, and joy will be ours. That's where our faith resides. We sit in belief and faith and trust that the deficit we know in our lives today will be filled when Jesus comes and brings the blessing of life the way it ought to be, with full joy. Some of you have not seen Jesus quite in this light. Maybe today would be a day that you would say, I want to have that kind of hope. I want to have that kind of joy, knowing that we can't change all the joy-draining things of our day right now. And yet, what a wonderful thing to know the one who provides this. If that's true of you, let me invite you on this day to say, I confess that I cannot manufacture my own joy. I can find it nowhere else but with Jesus. And today is a day that you can trust him to provide all that life ought to be. I'd love to talk with you, or Andy, or some of our other elders would love to talk with you if that's your situation, because today can be a day that changes all of life for you. So we've spoken a little bit about the miracle, the event itself, what happened on that day long ago. We've talked about what it means for our faith. Let's proceed for a moment for the call for commitment. What is it that John really wants us to do in light of this great miracle? I'll suggest this: to anticipate Jesus bringing us exceeding joy in the kingdom. That what John is advocating by recording this miracle is that we are to anticipate, to expect, to look forward, to lean into this reality that one day the bringer of great joy will make it happen. We live with that expectation. So some of you have been to my house, and you know that I have a wonderful big black Labrador Retriever. He's really one of my best friends. We have a lot of good conversations. He's quiet. He listens well. And generally, my dog Dallas, he just kind of lies motionless on the floor. He follows me from one room to the other, and wherever I go, he just comes in and flops down, and there you go. You know, you walk by him, and you might hear his tail go thump, 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 and that's it. Doesn't look like he's filled with a lot of energy until he begins to think that there's food in his future. And when Dallas begins to think it's time to eat, everything changes. His position, his posture, even his prayer life. All right? Because that dog will move to where his bowl is, or even better, he'll move into the kitchen and he'll sit like a prince right there under the counter with his nose, just navigating and kind of searching out any food stuff that he might be able to smell. He will sit up, he'll relocate, he will sit up, and then he starts even to yip a little bit with a few cries, whines of petition, praying that perhaps some food morsels are coming his way. He lives in anticipation, and everything changes. It's amazing how it changes our lives. And John is advocating that we will be people who anticipate this bringer of joy, Jesus, to provide one day exceeding joy for our lives. What does that look like? Well, probably lots of things could change in our lives when that is true. Those who anticipate the future kingdom, they don't look for external cleansing to bring the reward of joy. They don't try to perform so that God will give them joy. We don't try to boost ourselves up so that we'll look better and God will give us a better life. It doesn't work that way for people who are anticipating Jesus to bring exceeding joy. Here's a second idea, those who in fact anticipate future kingdom joy, they stop using other people like joy providers or joy suppliers. It's such an easy trap to fall. You know, if I just had a girlfriend, if I had a boyfriend, if I had the certain kind of spouse, my life would be so much more joyful. If my kids would just obey more and do what I ask, and they would grow up and be responsible and be good citizens, then my life would be filled with joy. And to begin to look at our relationships as levers, means to the end of giving us joy. And that's a dead-end street. Because those who anticipate that Jesus brings joy, exceeding joy, they don't leverage their relationships like that. Perhaps there's a third area where those who anticipate future kingdom joy look so much different than the world around us. We do not seek joy in, I'll call it, identity transformation. It's I'm going to make myself different. The self I have doesn't have much joy, so I'll make some changes to my life. So I'm going to lose some weight. I'm going to get a different body. I'm going to go to the gym. That'll bring me more joy. I don't like my gender, so no problem. I can change genders. I'm frustrated with my sexual orientation, so I'll change that, and perhaps that will bring me more joy. Or I really want more delight in my life, so I'll engage in inner meditation and breathing exercises and psychotherapy and such things that will help me control who I am so I can have a real joyful life. And while some work on our identity is probably good for us, those who anticipate joy from the Savior will not pursue it improperly by personal information. You see, it makes a difference what we long for and what we expect. Anticipate Jesus to bring us exceeding joy of the kingdom, so we don't seek that joy in external cleansing, internal transformation, or any other kind of effort that would replace our. You ever go to a symphony? It's quite fascinating when you find your seat. The lights are out in the house, and people are kind of coming in and finding their seats and reading their program and chatting with their neighbors and maybe scrolling through their phones. Attention is diffused, distributed, distracted. And then at just the right time, the house lights drop, and the conductor walks out to the stage. And as he picks up his baton, everyone's attention is drawn to the center. And it's like the whole crowd leans in anticipation of that burst of sound that will come from the symphony. It'll fill their ears and their hearts with delight. My friends, we have the privilege of leaning forward because the conductor has come to the earth and he's raised his baton, and it won't be long when the full joy will be ours.